I thought about the patio that Jo had described in her aunt's Pasadena house with wicker furniture and clay zuni pots. And yet, he returned to his original thought, the thing has a kind of magnificence. How brazen, and on what a prodigious scale. There has never been anything like it. Ce n'est pas le Parthenon, mais c'est le Debutante, as Anatole France once said about the art of the Gothic cathedrals. And that brings us back to your essay, he went on, as we came into the big library and poured ourselves tall drinks from a tray of ripe bottled liquors. We settled ourselves, I lying back on the ample red leather couch with the calmness and assurance of authority, awaiting a layman's questions, and he throning in a big leather chair. We were lighted by a single large lamp, which seemed to isolate us in the long dark room, as if our conference were important and private. What interests me particularly, he said, is your idea that the methods of the Impressionists were essentially the result of their unwillingness to look the contemporary world in the face. They created a veil between themselves and it. They couldn't come to grips with it, in fact, so that their work was unreal and worthless. This was not precisely what I had said, and he spoke, I thought, a little too dogmatically, as if he were telling me. I explained that though it was true that the Impressionists had sometimes been repelled by their century, their work could not be said to be worthless. They had made their own kind of beauty, though they had had to create special conventions under which it could be realized. And eventually, of course, I went on, it did come to present a reflection of the world from which it had tried to withdraw. When crystals began to form in the saturated solutions of the atmospheres of painters like Monet and Seurat, they made the abstract designs of angles that you get in a modern city and the accidental patterns that you would find in machines. You have Cubism, in other words. I have always been assured that Cubism, said Blackburn, who had listened to my remarks with attention, was an experiment in pure and fundamental form, and now you explain it quite comprehensibly as the product of historical necessity. I shall be interested to see if you can explain in such terms all the other aberrations of modern art. I told him that my book would deal only with the painting of the 19th century. But you must follow it with another volume. You must bring the story up to date. And in the meantime, you make us wait too long. Surely your museum work takes up too much of your time. You should have leisure to concentrate and complete your work. This is the moment when such a book is needed, when it can help us to orient ourselves. The stability of the bourgeois order is crumbling away before us, and we see its disintegration in the chaos of modern painting. The ordinary critic, whose bread depends on his persuading people to take his painting seriously, tells us that we must admire. You tell us we may sometimes admire, but we must see these deformities and splotches as the symptoms of the rickets and neuroses from which our civilization suffers. But it's also true, I tried to insist, that what seems to be decadence in art may involve what is really the beginning of a greater creative movement. The artists of the future may be influencing life through murals and posters and illustrating and other things we haven't imagined, in a way that our gallery painters have never dreamed of doing and pretend they'd scorn to do. Yet they'll probably look back to Picasso and the rest as pioneers who made their work possible, who rescued art from the photograph and set it free to act directly on the emotions. The artists of the future, said Blackburn with a sudden sardonic dryness, will perhaps, as Bernard Shaw says, be earning a few poor pennies by drawing with colored chalks on the pavements. Then you think civilization is going to hell? He smiled as if he had been caught off his guard. Figuratively, perhaps, he said, but not in the literal sense. If we're in for some catastrophic happenings, they will hardly turn out to the advantage of hell. The devil will not find that it pays. Footnote. In the original book, the following long monologue by the character Blackburn is in French. For the convenience of the listener, it has been translated into English. The European world, permit me to express myself in French, is tending to become hardened to every consideration of morality, to such a degree that soon it will do without it, as well as without him whom it is forbidden to oppose. It doesn't matter to you if we speak French. I know that you know it very well. Were you brought up in France? No? Then you have a very keen ear. I have happened, during the last few years, to resort more and more to this language, so refined and so clear. It is the sole means, I find, of giving a semblance of logic to events which are becoming more and more insane every minute. What he said about my French was not true, but it pleased me to hear him say it. His own French I had always thought that of a Belgian businessman or of an American lawyer who had practiced in Paris. But as I listened to him talking tonight, I seemed to note in it a certain flavor, a turn of phrase of the 18th century. Returning to the earlier topic, I asked him whether the Nazis in Germany were doing nothing to gratify the devil. As for Hitler himself, he replied, he is hardly interesting to the devil. He's a saint, a patriot, a model in the style of Joan of Arc. The imbecile doesn't wish to do evil. He spares no expense on moral principle to slaughter a Jew or a Pole, because he doesn't know what a man is, since he is scarcely one himself. He's a fool, a paranoid, like most saints, moreover. He believes quite simply that they are persecuting him, that the country is being persecuted through him, and that he must defend himself. As for the other Nazis, don't you agree, except for Goebbels, who is a rather fine example of an unsuccessful, spiteful man of letters? They are only disreputable third- or fourth-rate men, or a bunch of common German Schafköpfe, who, from the moment they no longer take the sovereign judge or his adversary seriously, come upon a nice discovery. They find that they are in a position to do anything they want on this earth without running the risk either of being struck by lightning on the spot by the one, or of being afflicted by the agents of the other. I should not wish, however, to give the impression of not attaching importance to this certainty of contemporary man, that he is free to destroy or to build, to do whatever appears good to him and to those who agree to it, without regard to the good and evil set up by superhuman powers. This revolution against the moral plane is even the most important event of our time, an event beside which the regroupings one hears so much about either seem to be only very superficial changes, the replacement of one pack of rascals by another, a political sleight of hand which is without any meaning, because the social classes, which are interchangeable, both express exactly the same ideas and seek identical ends. Or else these regroupings owe their only interest to the fact that they are set in motion by the impetus of this central motivating force. Nearly the same thing can be seen in Russia. Stalin himself does what he wishes with the Russians because, as a Marxist, he has not recoiled from the liquidation of religion, and suddenly he has become, with a savage joy and a little astonishment, I believe, supreme and immutable master of 170 million human beings, whom he knows how to drive like a large tractor on one of his collective farms. He can organize them, can he not, on any which scale to accomplish any which work. He can even make them swallow the absurd lies of Pravda, and he can impart to them any idea whatever. First he tells them of the 5-year plan, and then he harnesses them to the drudgery of factory and public construction, a type of business which the Russians like very little. Then he will make them fight the Germans at a cost of 25 million men, after which Comrade Stalin will have opened his gates to the Nazis, and, so to speak, expressly invited them to invade the Russian fatherland. For this very limited man admires Hitler, and is even awestruck by him. He will need watchfulness to become a close ally the day this madman demonstrates with bomb blast and machine gun that to admire a great amoral power, one must not confide in him, especially when one has pretensions of playing an amoral role himself. I speak of things which have not yet passed, but which surely will happen. Little enthusiasm though I felt for Stalin, I could not believe in these fantastic prophecies, which seemed to me prompted by some spirit of perversity, at the same time Philistine and cynical. And I reminded him that it had been, after all, the idealists Lenin and Trotsky who had first mobilized and unified the Russians, and that the Soviet Union had been dedicated to the establishment of a socialist society. I spoke of the morality of Marxism and of the creative aims of the Marxists. I do not doubt, he replied, that Lenin and Trotsky, as does Marx, owe their morality to them, but this rather lofty morality only holds moderate interest for him whom you know as the devil. Doubtless there are striking vestiges of the old Protestant theology in this system, which boasts of being disencumbered of all religiosity, but it is without doubt the last ray of a light that is being extinguished, and it appears to me, moreover, only too evident that the Marxist system is always going to be debased by it, and that the time is not far off when Stalin will lay it under an edict and will have no scruples about exterminating those who practice it. Meanwhile, I grant you that the grandiose projects which they are striving to realize in the Soviet Union can very well be directed toward an end which you would characterize as good, that they can even end up there. Yet chances would appear to me at least equal that they will end up in what you call evil. In one case or the other, the main point for the person we're talking about is that the Russians as well as the Germans would only act for uniquely practical reasons, and that they would not be concerned about the old-time illusion of these powers of heaven and hell to which their ancestors rendered so much homage. You are right if you think that the devil would not be fool enough to remain for long in these atheistic countries where his work is no longer valued and where he no longer feels at home. He is a great person, a model of a great person, as Saint-Simon said of Voltaire, with the important difference that posterity has been kind to Voltaire. He gave a rueful and ironic smile. He is a great person of the old European world who has adapted as best he can to the capitalist society, but who no longer speaks the same language as these scoundrels in the Kremlin and in Wilhelmstrasse, these khami, as one would have heard them called formerly in Russia. You no doubt remember the Soviet agent, the professional informer whom you met here. He is a very capable man, very sharp, a native of Bessarabia, who speaks all languages marvelously. He has even, something rather rarely seen among Soviet diplomats, learned to acquire, in the course of his travels, a certain knowledge of the world. In the old days, I would have recruited him quite willingly, but today I am not the least taken in by him. I no longer have anything to offer him. I assure you that this man frightens me. It is he who tries to tempt me. When he wrote me requesting me to receive him, I would have liked to be able to flatter myself with the hope that he had some need of me, although the rather peremptory tone with which he spoke to me did not leave me without uneasiness. I knew well that he had been assigned to the embassy to spy on the unhappy ambassador, and to be on the watch lest the ambassador take too much of an interest in the country to which he was accredited, and I was unable to refrain from asking myself if he had been told to pry into my affairs. Well, he had the cheek to suggest that I devote part of my time, a part-time job, as we say, to his beautiful organization. He explained to me with a candor which by no means sought to humor my sensibilities as the senior representative of evil, since I am well aware that he has neither the means nor the need to conceal my identity from you. You are very intelligent, and I dare hope that it will not embarrass you if I speak to you with complete frankness. This idiot then demonstrated to me with a logic of steel that the good G, that my opposite number, it is I this time who was almost disrespectful, that's the vice of this century, as I was saying just now, contempt for sacred things, that my opposite number had been liquidated, and that my own occupation was gone, and that I couldn't do better than to enlist in the service of the USSR. I tried to make him acknowledge that there still remained some genuine active traces of conscious human malignity in Russia. I mentioned some of the government's public lies, which to me had the appearance of being as gratuitous as the rather passion-rousing inventions of the incomparable Russian novel, and I recalled for him some of the acts of cruelty which seemed to me absolutely worthy of the wonderful days of Ivan the Terrible. I pointed out to him the Russian word chistka, a delicious euphemism which means in its literal sense very simply a light purge, but which is also used to designate the condemnation to death or to forced labor of 1,000,000 men and women who have done nothing more blameworthy than to devote their entire lives to applying the principles of Lenin and to striving to complete his work. Footnote. Mr. Blackburn was in error here. In Russian, the ending ka is not necessarily diminutive. It may have an active force, vyveska, vystavka, etc. But it was natural for Mr. Blackburn to think of it the other way, and the official to whom he was talking had not thought about the matter at all. "Always these diminutives," I said to him. "They are these childish ways of speaking which give so much charm, don't you think, to the adorable Russian language?" Without speaking of Ivan IV, he answered me, eloquent as a lawyer, haughty and hard as a judge, whom we have come to recognize as the formidable stabilizer of disunited and savage Russia, as well as the founder of docile and strong Russia. "I can tell you that under the Soviet regime, all the diminutives of the old Russian language, which are only debasing mementos of the cajoling, cringing manners of feudal thraldom, I can tell you that these dainty childishnesses are in the process of disappearing. We only tolerate them, we men of culture, because of the imposed necessity of yielding now and then to the ridiculous penchants of a rather backward people, waiting for them to learn a more modern language, very technical and trenchant, which will leave no room for these demeaning, insipid daintinesses." He assured me, besides, quite insistently, that there had never been any conscious cruelty in the purges which were administered in Russia, and I am obliged, to be sure, to believe him. Stalin himself, naturally, as well as several of his officials, are not like Hitler and the common German butchers. They are either a bunch of primitive men to whom vengeance brings a vivid joy, or a lot of timid, ambitious beings who like to crush, while enjoying a cruel pleasure, souls who are more courageous and unselfish. But in general, it is only too true that in Stalin's Russia, they are successfully training the young people to employ this murderous behavior with an almost automatic cold-bloodedness. The condemned are shot in the back, as you know, while being brought from the court. Blood flows through 2 narrow channels cut into the side of the road, and it is washed away with strong jets of water which allow no trace of it to remain. The corpse remains for scarcely any length of time. It is carried away, buried, and thought about no more. In cases where the wife disappears also, there is no concern for the children who, without any understanding of it, suddenly find themselves orphans and become objects of scorn to their school playmates and even to their teachers. No one dares come to their aid. But what annoys me is that no one even feels pleasure in thinking of the misfortunes of these orphans. They are simply allowed to fall like pieces that aren't big enough onto the conveyor belts of tailorized factories, while all other nations than the Soviet Russians take care to gather them together and to find some use for them, although we must not forget, of course, that the human resources of Russia are as unlimited as its wheat and its minerals. As for Hitler's Germany, you can take my word for it, since I doubt that you will go there, it will be even more so. They will apply themselves very systematically to asphyxiating and to burning people wholesale in types of murder factories built expressly for the purpose. They will reduce them to ashes with an astonishing speed and send them in large sacks to the agricultural regions to serve as manure for the fields. They will draft into service for this, at first, pathological criminals, whom they will release from their chain gangs on the condition that they devote themselves to crimes even more sordid than those for which they were imprisoned. But this is only a temporary expedient, which they will use only until the day they have taught the young people that all non-German things are not human, so that they will find themselves in the position of discharging such duties without flinching, but also without taking the slightest pleasure in it. This is naturally hardly something to cheer me up. How I will miss the good taste of the French the day France finds herself, as she will, vanquished by these brutish Boches. French cruelty is a bit of a national specialty, isn't it, like cooking and literary criticism. What a marvelous garden of torments, that's the beautiful title of a book by Mirabeau, is the French novel From Laclos to Proust. François de Sade, what a formidable genius. I was dreaming of him not long ago when I was meditating on the unspeakable baseness of these Soviet Russians. You will pardon me if I continually refer to them, who have no scruples against denouncing their fathers and their mothers, their brothers and their sisters, their lovers, their mistresses, and their best friends. No doubt you are aware that the Marquis De Sade was, during the Terror, a judge of the Revolutionary Court. It happened by chance one day that his mother-in-law and his father-in-law had to appear before him. Now, his wife's parents, her mother especially, had persecuted him without respite and without pity ever since his marriage, had him arrested 3 times, and even wanted to have him imprisoned for life. Well, this amazing man, who found himself in a position to get rid of them, saved them from the scaffold. "I have had my revenge," said he. He knew well that there was no better way to exasperate his mother-in-law, who had persecuted him for 30 years with an implacable hatred, treating him like an inhuman monster. It was a witticism that was very French, very refined, very discreet, very pure. "The trouble for the Marquis," he added, with a sharp, pleased and jeering laugh, "is that the joke caused him to be accused of a suspected political moderatism. He was immediately condemned to death, which greatly cheered up the old woman." Ah, the marvelous 18th century! They still believed while proclaiming free thought and a disdain for morality. Blasphemies and mockeries proved that religion had not yet lost its dominion. As for myself, I have nothing further to do in a world where no religion exists, and I can no longer dwell there. That is why I am doing everything in my power to bring religion back to Europe. Does that surprise you? It had surprised me for a moment, though I remembered that he had entertained Jacques Maritain, Father Darcy, and Monsignor Sheen. I noticed rather late that I had been guilty of a serious mistake which almost proved fatal to me. I woke up one fine morning with the scarcely comforting feeling that the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages had followed the path of good policy, for me as well as for herself, when she burned her heretics. She was well aware that from the moment a single one of her articles of faith were put in doubt, from the moment when one was advised to meditate on these things by himself, that would be it for religion. There would only be total decadence. I myself did not see clearly in the old days, but it is only too evident now. All these very intelligent rebels on whom I occasionally dared to rely to help me in my work, however sympathetic they might seem to you, the Church knew very well what she was doing when she suppressed them with pitiless severity. From the instant Luther escaped from the flock, the death knell for the Church tolled, which brought about not just the division of the Catholic Church, but the progressive weakening of the concept of a church itself. And I fear she will exist only until there is no more worship, hence no more true religion, because no one would know whether to accept as religions the rationalist, purely ethical sects, such as the positivism of France, or the Unitarianism of your country. I can tell you, he added, dropping his indignant tone with the lightness of good taste, that my own little cult almost doesn't exist anymore. It consists only of frivolous students or ridiculous pederasts who wish to do me the honor of rites which have fallen into disuse. As I was saying, I did not notice at first where the success of these fine preachers was leading. I vigorously supported them in their spouting of bolder words. The moralists have always provided abundant opportunities. The great ones are distinguished by an elevated spirit and a firm, well-disciplined character, which sometimes decay, through a thirst for power, with wonderful ease, into pride and fanaticism. The consciousness of virtue, you see, sometimes produces a kind of drunkenness, by which one comes to persuade himself quite willingly that all who disagree with him have no right to persist in their errors. And when one is permitted to become fanatical in his wish to make people virtuous, he ends up by doing my work, as does your neighbor Mr. Stryker, he added with a humorous smile, a true offshoot, implacable and tenacious of Protestant stock. So I began to revel in this new kind of moralist who, in an interesting way quite different from the idiot princes of the Church, showed that they had a power so fresh and strong, and who had an unheard-of influence over the most intractable people of their time. The best Calvinists were the equals of Torquemada, and the Protestant movements resulting in the cannibalistic bumpkin Robespierre fascinated me so much that I did not immediately realize that the worshippers of the Supreme Being were no longer paying attention to me. Next, I had not yet recovered from my surprise and my chagrin when I found myself in the presence of Marx, who, I willingly grant you, he gave me a sly look, could be offended by some bigoted and destructive traits, but who only furnished men as a religion his dialectical materialism. You're right in thinking that I did not find much pleasure in perpetually playing the role of thesis in this rather abstract theology which imposed on me the absurd obligation of being periodically consumed, so to speak, by the always virtuous antithesis, a process which forcibly compelled me to revoke my individuality. I've tried to yield to it, and I have not succeeded. Here I am, suddenly embroiled, embarrassed, and engulfed in boring and interminable discussions, which recall to mind the Christian casuist, but which possess none of his flexibility or elegance. The worst thing is that the proponents of Marxist morality don't even take it seriously. They only want and seek power, a completely worldly power, which, whether it reflects for future humanity a more abundant life or total servitude, no longer leaves me a reason to exist. In short, I have emigrated to your country, where these tendencies have not yet developed to such a deadly state. You have done some rather fine things, haven't you, in the cause of a strong morality? The Mathers and Jonathan Edwards. It seems to me I heard you speak on them with much perspicacity last summer. They were true Titans. And to think that Aaron Burr was the grandson of Edwards. In my opinion, it is the most remarkable intellectual family in the United States. My friend Hamilton, whom I shot, in the entire 18th century I did not know of a more clever witticism, although I believe it was said a little after 1800. Burr often kept company with me when he was living in Europe. He became in his last years a true European. Footnote. The original text now returns to English. I had been listening with mounting impatience. I did not believe in the horrors he predicted. I had never been able to take Hitler seriously, and I was all for giving Soviet Russia the benefit of every doubt. Now I found that it annoyed and disturbed me to hear him talk about American history in French, and from that point of view. And I told him in English that I wondered nonetheless at his coming to the United States, since the Protestant disintegration had gone farther here than anywhere in Europe. That's quite true, he admitted promptly. But the Puritan sense of sin, the respect for my distinguished opponent, and I may say a certain awareness of myself, is still pervasive in American society. The Catholics, too, you may have noticed, have been particularly active here of late. Some profess to see my hand in that. But I assure you the activities attributed to me were already well underway before I turned my attention to them, and I have often found them crude and distasteful. Nous sommes bien loin de Rome ici. I must say that my wife has found a better field. She is in constant demand as a speaker, lecturing to women's clubs, meeting the social leaders, and keeping in touch with the settlement work. She believes that the American women can now claim undisputed first place for initiative, aggressiveness, audacity, resourcefulness, and dispassionate intelligence. I asked him whether the rumor were true that she was to be offered a nomination for the Senate. It's impossible to say anything definite. He did not seem to care much to discuss it, and I felt in him a certain embarrassment mingled with a real pride. But she won't forgive me, he said, for keeping you from her so long. We went back through the dining room, where the refreshments were laid out on a lavish scale, white tablecloths, pink hams, gleaming urns, and I remembered the evening in that house when I had had my first talk with Imogen. It seemed to me, in a moment of disquietude, of sudden disgust and doubt, though I hardly knew whether with myself or with the life that these things represented, that I had never really enjoyed those refreshments, that I had never got out of such occasions something I had hoped to get. I had at first, in my session with Blackburn, rather relished his cosmopolitan tone, his range of reference in time and place, but he was a gross enough fellow at best, and I was repelled by his efforts to flatter me. Still, there was something in what he said about religion. We had to evolve our own morality now, and that applied to my problem about Joe as much as to the behavior of nations. Wasn't it really just an old superstition, the religion of romantic love, that made me feel it was not right to marry her? Part 2. When we came in through the back doorway of the living room, Kate Blackburn was not far away in the crowd. Smartly dressed in a black organdy evening gown, she stood talking to a tall young lawyer, who was laughing at something shrewd she had just said. But when she saw me, she looked in my direction with so quick an apparent interest that I went over to her. She began without greeting. "I have a bone to pick with you. I don't agree at all with what you said in your article about Ingres's women. Ingres was a hell of a great painter, and his women are beautiful, moon-faced dolls, but they're not representative of the period. He's left out something that is always important if you're trying to do a portrait of a woman, and that was especially very, very important in the days of the Directory and Napoleon. Fuseli does it wonderfully. They had just the same gals in England. I think you ought to write about Fuseli." I was surprised at her line of approach and at the definiteness of her opinions. The comparison of Fuseli with Ingres had no artistic point whatever, but I saw that she did mean something. I remembered that Haydn had said that the women Fuseli drew were all strumpets, but there was also something else about them, and I vividly recalled a face in the background of a picture called The Debutante, a woman not young, with dark eyebrows, sharp eyes, and a painted, immodest mouth, who had a queer, long, giraffe-like neck encased in a kind of collar. "No, Ingres's women are all idealized," she went on, when I tried to explain that I hadn't necessarily meant that Ingres's portraits covered every kind of woman, even when they're being coy in the harem. I liked your article, though. If you only wouldn't try sometimes to put quite so much into one sentence, and would talk about things a little more concretely, keep closer to the actual canvases." She was really quite intelligent, I recognized, much more so than poor old Ed. My writing did sometimes have those faults. I admired her in her well-hung black evening gown that had tricky angular flaps at the shoulders, with a little diamond crescent in her hair. She was tall and rather thin, but quite attractive, her straightness and pale intensity somehow saved from the dryness of the bluestocking and the tiresome self-assertiveness of the career woman by the presence of something more female, something of what the French call du chien, a flavor of sensuality and smartness. She had rather a wide mouth, with lips in which I now saw a suggestion of that matron of Fuseli's drawing, who had also the look of a procuress. Otherwise, though always keeping this quality, she had reminded me on certain occasions of that type of upper-class German woman, very dignified, emphatic, and well-informed, who is social in a serious way and shows the military tradition behind her, and, on others, of one of those rich Middle Western girls who expect to be served like queens and have the malignity of a deep, solemn selfishness. Yet she had also, like the Slavic women, a habit of half-shutting her eyelids when anything flickered in talk, to alarm her or put her on guard. And now, for a moment, she turned on this quick blinking, as I continued to insist on the nobility of Ingres's porcelain faces. "We must talk about this more," she said. "I really know a lot about that period. I've got to finish an argument now with Charlie Fields, who's defending the Mangiare machine." "On what grounds?" I glanced humorously toward Charlie. "He says it's an excellent thing because everybody's satisfied with it, and they send people Christmas turkeys and sometimes pay the hospital bills when their job holders' wives are sick. I say that it's a disgrace to the state, and that we've got to get them out of office. Now, don't forget we're going to talk some more. Come back and find me later, promise? Here's an old friend of yours who's thirsting to see you. Don't forget, though, don't disappear." There was a friendliness in her fierce dark eyes which had made me assume on her part some special appreciation, and now she gave me a swift smile, and a briefly lingering look which might indicate, I thought, that she meant it, though one could never really tell with such women who were hostesses and politicians. The old friend was not precisely a friend, but a man with whom I had gone to school. His school nickname did come to my lips, but I could not remember anything else about him. He was a broad-shouldered blond fellow in light brown tweeds who must have grown very much stouter since our school days. He had high cheekbones, a ruddy face, a pug nose, and a certain boyish, humorous charm. We drank a couple of highballs together, and it turned out in the course of our conversation that he was a watch manufacturer in Waterbury, being now head of his father's business. He was a shade apologetic about it and referred to himself as one of your hated capitalists, but he talked with a good deal of acuteness about the iniquities of investment banking, which he said he had always thought was cockeyed. I could believe that this was not merely hindsight, for I could see that he was a canny New Englander. He told me also that he had been following my writing, and he thought my recent article was swell, and he asked me as he lit his pipe whether it wasn't a great satisfaction to know that I had been plugging along at something worthwhile when everybody else had been going crazy. I, on my side, was reflecting that a businessman like Bud could be a great deal more interesting to talk to than most of the professional intellectuals. He was essentially serious-minded, but he read only what he wanted to read, unaffected by snobberies or cults, and he thought about things for himself, arriving at conclusions which were all the more striking for not being theoretical. And the truth was that, contrary to what I had assumed in the days when I was seeing Anna, I found myself at home with Bud in a way that I had perhaps never been with any of my newer friends. The common experience of school was something one could sit back on so solidly. That was my language that we were speaking, after all. That was my way of thinking. We were men of goodwill, he and I, and we met the crude and stupid world that we had found when we got out of college, like those schoolboys who had laughed at the authorities and yet had wanted to do something high and fine. We talked about John L. Lewis, Charlie Mitchell, Franklin Roosevelt, and Henry Ford, characterizing them and speculating about them in the same contemptuous or admiring way that one had done on one's Sunday walks or lying in bed at night in going over the masters and the more prominent fellows. And we reverted indeed now to those big men of our so long dispersed class, and I heard for the first time from Bud a lot of startling or amusing news about people that I had not seen for years. Their impressive or slightly comic successes, their sudden suicides, their multiple divorces, and then finally we fell back on the masters. It was surprising with what gusto we discussed them, comparing notes and each furnishing data that the other had never known. It was a shock to me that Mr. Maxton had been suspected of taking dope, and interesting to hear that Leif Erikson had used to slip away to Philadelphia and sit on a park bench all alone. And Bud's impression of Mr. Jelliff had been totally unlike mine, for I had been good at Greek, whereas Bud, as he now told me, had usually sat paralyzed in class, staring at his book and afraid to stir, as he waited for his turn to come round. There had always been an element of awe in our relations with the masters at school, that we had carried all through our careers there from the days when we had been new boys. And it was as if it were at last a relief, even after so many years, to break the spell and talk with perfect freedom. Soon I was imitating Jelliff, and Bud was imitating McGee. I remembered that there was something in Thackeray about dining with certain gentlemen whose time of life could be guessed from the fact that they had amused themselves by mimicking their old headmaster. Well, that, then, was the phase I had got to, and wasn't it, after all, rather a pleasant one, and one that there was no need to be ashamed of? Weren't we lucky to have been taught so well? It had given us a precious advantage in an age that seemed increasingly illiterate. Good old Thackeray. One had perhaps been underrating him, and good old world of his, too, perhaps of which, when one read him in childhood, it had still been possible to think as connected with one's own world in America. I had identified myself with Pendennis during my solitary rides as a boy, on his excursions between Clavering and Chatteris, and perhaps it was still there after all, where one could reach it with only a step. Bud had just asked me to visit him in Waterbury, where I imagined there would be comfortable families who had always known one another, who had endured and kept their virtue, as families did not often do in our region. What if one really had been in it all the time and had never quite made connections with anything else one had tried? What if one really belonged to all that? Wasn't Hecate County part of it, too? I did, of course, love the neighbors and the gossip, the going to people's houses. By now, I knew the locality minutely, and I explained to Bud that the curious name was merely one of those many classical place names like Syracuse, Hannibal, and Rome that the early inhabitants of the country appeared to have picked at random out of Plutarch. I also explained the people who passed or who came up and spoke to me so cordially that I found I was in some way proud of them, proud of knowing them all, and being known by them. It took, I told myself, years to get to know them and to be really sympathetic with them, but there was much that was fine about them that you might not have noticed at first. They were even rather interesting in spots, and it was fun to be at home with all the sets, as one got to do in time, and not to be part of any. I told mothers how good-looking their children were becoming. I asked the boat lovers about their boats. I discussed whether or not it would be possible for me to take one of a litter of cockers. I promised a bored and boring, middle-aged married woman that I would come to see the paintings she had been doing. I had said some pleasant things about her first attempts, and I could hear myself saying some more. And it seemed to me that there was no harm in this, since it was all on the kindergarten level, and one encouraged her as one did a child. "I hear you found a rare bird the other day," I said to a frail, shy, high-bridged man who went in for serious bird watching. He recounted to us with excited pride how he had phoned to the state ornithologist, who had come straight out and shot the specimen, and expounded with distinguished precision the difference between an extinct and an extirpated bird. "He's by way of being an extirpated bird himself," I said, smiling to my companion when he had left us, and told Bud about the bird-watcher's wife, who despised his ornithological activities and had complained, if he would only shoot something so that at least we could have it to eat. "Some pretty terrific women around here," said Bud. I had not met Bud's wife, but I was sure that he had known her since childhood, and I wondered whether she were the jolly kind who had kept up with the cocktail era, or the more provincial kind who did not try to look young and smart. The former, I liked to think. I had not met Bud's wife, but I was sure that he had known her since childhood, and I wondered whether she were the jolly kind who had kept up with the cocktail era, or the more provincial kind who did not try to look young and smart. The former, I liked to think. "I've come to finish our conversation." Kate Blackburn was standing beside me. "You may have thought you'd escaped me, but I'm very tenacious." She took me away to the corner behind the piano, where there were relatively few people. "How did you get along with Charlie?" I asked. "Did you convince him of the need for reform?" "Oh, I like Charlie Fields a lot. He always makes me laugh." At the moment, I was hardly conscious that this remark about Charlie Fields was not precisely the kind of thing that one might have expected from Kate. My attention had been drawn in the other direction, toward the piano, where a cluster had gathered and where someone was about to play. "You certainly had a field day," she said, hashing over school with Bud Webster. "I always thought you scorned Hillside." "This is not going to be so quiet," I said. The piano splashed out a passage from Carmen, and a high, distinct, cultivated voice began mincing out a song about a beautiful cigarette girl at the Stork Club, and a man named Don Jose Hemingway, who wanted to be a Toreador. "Ernie Fay's singing one of his songs," she said. "I haven't dared ask him to, because I did once when I first knew him, and he turned sour for the whole evening." She was shy, I reflected, and had a great deal of delicacy behind her sometimes too assertive manner. Ernie Fay, though she had known him for years, was a professional nightclub performer. "You didn't ask him, did you?" she said. No, I didn't know he was here. But of course I had known he was coming. We had talked over the list together. She was chuckling at all the sly points in the song, which became more and more risque, and Ernie Fay, as he wriggled and twitched, would sometimes turn all the way round and cock an eyebrow in her direction. A big crowd had gathered about him. Joe was immensely pleased. "I wonder whether he'll sing another," she said, when the laughter and applause were fading. "You know, I think this is the best party we've ever given together. Maybe it's because I'm tight, but everybody seems to be having a good time, even you and your old hillside friend, and you usually complain about too many Babbitts." It was awfully pleasant. We were having fun, and Joe, I thought, looked perfectly lovely in her black organdy evening gown. I had never seen it before, and it gave her something clear and classic, somehow imposing reserve on her smiling California openness, and bringing out a pure forehead, a straight nose, a firm chin, and a well-modeled mouth. Almost she might have been painted by Ingres. I watched her with a new admiration all through the rather nauseating song. "Come outside a minute," I said, when everybody was clapping and cheering. "I want to tell you something." She went with me in silence. I was satisfied and proud, and I also felt really excited. There would be people in the courtyard, I knew, so I took her to the terrace at the side of the house. I kissed her, holding her tight against me, one arm about her naked shoulders, the other under her soft bare armpit, just where the breast begins. And she seemed to me voracious and hot as I had never known her before. I said nothing, for the kiss said all. But we couldn't go on, so at last I stopped and looked away to distract myself. There above us, in the sky, where it was always summer, hung the dust of the richly sprinkled stars that gave the illusion, out here, of being both closer to and more tinsely than they ever did in the east. The stars of the blissful Pacific that had the look of festive decorations for people to be gay or to make love by, yet with which I had never been able to feel myself in any vital relation as I did with the remote ones at home. I spoke of this, and when I looked back at her face, I saw that she was smiling, and gazing up with her lips parted in such a way as to show great long, bare-gummed teeth that stuck out and yet curved back like tushes, and that seemed almost too large to be contained in her mouth. She looked like a dog panting when you take it out for a drive, and for a moment I was sharply repelled. But then saying, "Yes, I see what you mean," she closed her lips and the teeth disappeared. I saw only her wide, wet mouth, and I pounded kisses against it with summoned, determined passion, tasting her perfume and her flesh. It was precisely those long teeth, I thought, that gave her large mouth its peculiar attractiveness. It might have been unpleasant, but wasn't. "We ought to go back," she said softly. "Reggie Daluzze is completely pie-eyed, and I'm afraid he'll get out of hand. If he once gets started singing songs, Ernie Fay will never have another chance." We turned back. "I'll check up on Reggie," I said. "You've been handling things beautifully tonight," I added, as we entered the living room and heard the roar of the conversation. "I've never known you to be so nice about a party," she added, with a sincerity that touched me. I reflected that I had been pretty wonderful. I had had that fine talk with Bud Webster when I had so caught and entered into his point of view that he could hardly have known how different my own was. And there had been my brilliant French performance when I had talked to that young Swiss from the embassy and improvised a discourse on the demise of religion as blandly subversive as Anatole France. But I mustn't, I reminded myself, indulge too much in the easy satisfaction of feeling social and intellectual superiority to the people one met on the coast. Anatole France, indeed. They had only just discovered him in Hollywood and thought it made them sophisticated to read him. We parted inside. She, so friendly and happy, stopped to talk to a new arrival, and I floated among the guests. I made my way with light smiles and host's jokes to the crowd about the piano, and there, just as Joe had feared, was Reggie Daluzzi at Ernie Fay's elbow, bent over with one arm around his shoulder, singing a song of his own composition, which I felt he had every intention of soon letting the company hear. Who'll bite your neck, your swan's down neck, after my teeth are gone? It wasn't really as dirty as the monologues that Ernie Fay had cooked up in New York, and I thought it was just as funny, but there seemed to be a general agreement that Ernie Fay's stuff was clever, whereas Reggie's somewhat decadent version of the old-fashioned rough Western humor was considered by many people distasteful. Yet I felt that these rather kiddish parodies had seemed much funnier back in the 20s, when everybody had been more or less kiddish, especially as I heard him start a ballad of which the refrain began, "So we played a little game of 10 toes up and also 10 toes down." When he had finished, I took him by the arm. He turned around with badly focused eyes. He was evidently very tight. He had lost more hair from the front of his head and was getting a lantern-jawed look. I told him that I wanted to talk to him, and then, when we had stepped back from the piano, "That song is a riot," I said. "Is that one of your own, too?" "I wrote words and music," he answered. "I sing it, and I can lead the band." I steered him back into the pleasant little library. "Look," I began, "I don't know Hollywood, and I wanted to ask you something. I understand they have people in the movies who advise them about period furniture and historical decors and that sort of thing. Now, I've had a certain amount of experience working on those period rooms in the American wing at the Metropolitan, and I wondered whether there'd be any use in my talking to somebody about a job." I was startled by what I heard myself saying, especially since I had never really worked in the American wing at the museum, but I told myself it was all in the interest of keeping Reggie away from the piano, and after all, it might be worthwhile to inquire about this matter. In the long run, it would be impossible to let Joe go on paying the bills. "Don't do it," he urged me. "Don't do it. For a hack like me, Hollywood's all right, but you've still got your integrity." He used this word as if it meant virginity. "And by God, you hang on to it. Why, you wouldn't survive the first conference. You don't know what those apes are like. You know, the first time Freddie Lonsdale sat in on a discussion with Bloomberg, Bloomberg asked him what he thought of the picture, and Freddie said he thought it was appalling. 'Yes,' said Bloomberg, 'but aside from that, what do you think of it?' Can you imagine yourself up against something like that? Listen, they got Ted Merriman out, and he didn't last out his first contract. He found at the end of the second week that he was always skipped over in conference. It turned out that the trouble was that he'd been too polite to Danziger's wife. The ironic thing was that she'd slept with everybody else in Hollywood, but she hadn't slept yet with Ted. He'd just been giving her his Baltimore gallantry. Why, you wouldn't be able to stand it a month. They're all drugged with making money. It's disgusting. A friend of mine, who's a lawyer at Long Beach, came up to see me one weekend, and I took him to a party where they all sat around and talked about their options and their salaries. Pretty soon I noticed that my friend had disappeared, and I found him pacing the floor in the next room. He said, "All that kind of talk's damned embarrassing, you know, when you're trying to make up your mind whether you're going to have enough money to buy linoleum for the kitchen floor." Of course, I'm not up in those brackets myself. I only make $500 a week. I belong to the proletariat, and I'm getting pretty damned red, I'll tell you. Since the writers took a 50% cut and the producers saved $1 million, I don't believe in the Screenwriters Guild. It doesn't go far enough. But a real hard-boiled left organization that wasn't afraid of the blacklist could get those sons of bitches on their backs. And the time will be ripe for that when the Guild demonstrates its impotence. But you, good God, I don't believe you'd have a chance competing with those interior decorators that do most of that kind of work. You're not one of the boys, and I don't think they'd let anybody else in. You might better apply to the Los Angeles Museum. Not that they've got much there in the way of art. It's mostly prehistoric bones dug out of the La Brea tar pit. You know what they mean by culture in Hollywood? Scriabin's golden poem in the Hollywood Bowl. They think that Scriabin's some kind of big orange. Still, you might be able to pick something up. They're impressed as hell with Eastern highbrows, and it's just a question of having an in, if you can bear to play up to those pansies. Some of them are way up in 5 figures. If you could convince somebody like Danziger or Bloomberg that you were a big authority from New York, the top man at the Metropolitan, you might even start off in the big dough. That's the way they do it. They come on with prestige, and they get paid $100 grand for their names and doing practically nothing. There's been more than one case, in fact, of people you thought were sensitive aesthetes soon ending up dripping with annuities and whooping at the producer's jokes. Follansbee, Winter, my God. He's living in a Beverly Hills palace with a private projection room, a custom-made Ferris wheel, a tennis court that's specially processed so that it's proof against hail, rain, and earthquakes, a double-sized bathtub with a phonograph attachment. If you can get along with the decorator element, and I don't suppose there's any reason why you shouldn't, I don't mean any unpleasant implications, but I suppose all you period experts more or less speak the same language. His mood had now altered completely, and he was eyeing me with hostile suspicion, as if I were a dangerous competitor and already in enjoyment of these prizes. Me, I'm a plugger in the galleys. I've spent 3 years writing gags and 2 doing dialogue for louse westerns, and I'm still struggling along on a pittance. But I'm more of a radical at bottom than a lot of you Park Avenue Bolsheviks that have the Daily Worker brought up with your breakfast. And I'm enough of a dreamer to believe that the day is now not far distant when the sweated 500-a-week man is going to come into his own. Hell, he said, looking around the library, where can I get a drink? Why did you bring up the subject of Hollywood? I came to your house to forget it. He pulled himself to his feet. We could still hear someone playing the piano. I must go back, he said, and make comical for your customers. They're clamoring for that salacious song. I've got another new number, too. Ernie Fay seems to think they're terrific, and I'm hoping he'll let me write some of his stuff. That's one part of my creative life that Hollywood hasn't been able to kill. I let him go, and I soon became occupied with saying goodbye to the guests. I was smiling and cordial and charming. Some I persuaded to stay for a nightcap, and then I would pass on to someone else. Coming back through the front door into the hall, after seeing some people into their car, I noticed Bud Webster and Joe standing together in the corner by the coat closet just underneath the stairs. Bud had his coat and hat on and seemed to be drawing away from Joe. I realized that they were not talking, and it occurred to me that he must have kissed her. I closed the door and came over toward them. "It's been a damn swell evening," said Bud, shaking hands with a firm, friendly grip. "We must get together again and talk about school some more. I believe that there were 1 or 2 points that we didn't get around to discussing." I seemed to notice an accent of irony. "Yes," I answered, rather coldly. "Good night." I turned back from the door to Joe and advanced on her with a certain grimness. She met my sharp, searching look with a gaze that might mean the blankness of innocence, or a masked doubt as to whether I knew. I dimmed this glare after a moment, however. "Well, they're almost all gone now," I said. "You dying on the party?" she asked. It was true. I confessed to myself that I was sleepy and bored and hostile. I shot her an ironic half-smile, and I saw her smile in return. She was on the point of saying something. I had the fear that she would show her teeth, and kissed her so that she could not grin, and she gave me the kisses back with what seemed to be frank, full-lipped affection. "Come upstairs," I said, with appetite and deep need. I had her. On the stairs I was sure of that. That momentary pose had meant nothing. I let her into a room with twin beds that were covered with ladies' wraps, velvet cloaks, and white flannel coats, and yellow camel's hair polo coats, strewn in a confused heap. I saw that there were still many guests, but I would vindicate my mastership against them. The night lamps, with maps on the shades, were burning beside the beds, and on the little green dressing table, painted prettily with pink and blue posies, guest-size powder puffs and lipsticks of various tints lay in front of the gilt-framed mirror. I turned the keys in the door to the hall and the door into the neighboring bedroom, and cleared a space across one of the beds by moving the coats away. There were a gold thing and a peacock blue thing that I had pleasure in flinging aside. "Tell me," I asked, taking both her hands, "did Bud Webster kiss you just now?" "He just kissed me goodbye," she said. "He always kisses me. I've known him all my life." "I didn't know you had." "Well, I have. He used to come out here when he was a kid. Now, don't be jealous. It's perfectly silly. Bud's never made a pass at me in his life." "Don't, darling." She was smiling, being sweet. I put my hand over her mouth. She pulled her face away. "What's the matter? Is my lipstick smeared?" I looked. "Yes, it is a little. If it was merely a good-night kiss, I don't see why your lipstick should be smeared like that." "You just kissed me yourself, you goof. Is that what you brought me up here for?" I clasped her and kissed her with desperate greed. Then I made her lie across the bed. She put one arm up over her eyes. Her legs dangled like a child's from her knees. The dignity of her hostess's gown all going for nothing now. "Move forward," I said, and put her legs up. Her white thighs and her lower buttocks were brutally now laid bare. Her feet, in silver open-work sandals, were pointing in opposite directions. What gusto I expected to taste in the coarse enjoyment of Jo in her evening gown, the fierce sense of violating a woman at her most contrivedly attractive, when she is usually beyond our reach, just as my club seemed to burn and exult in liberation from the formality of my evening clothes. But then she suddenly uncovered her face and turned her head toward the door into the hallway. Somebody was working the knob in a determined and vigorous fashion, and immediately a high nasal voice that had the clang of the Philadelphia main line came through the locked door so distinctly that I could see the intruder. Her tall, awkward figure and her bright black eye that had shrewdness but no sexuality. "Maybe somebody's passed out or been sick," she was suggesting to some companion. "I'll go and get Jo." She was a very good sort, goddamn her. She rattled the knob again. Jo jumped up, her flushed face embarrassing. "I'll go out through the other room," I told her, and quickly and quietly unlocked the door with a hand that fumbled inflamedly at the keyhole. It was a man's room, and there was a great leather dressing case full of silver-backed brushes and silver-topped flasks spread open for use on the bureau, and on the table a tall silver cup which I knew had been won in a golf tournament. I knew also that they belonged to me, yet I felt toward them the detachment and aversion of a guest toward an unsympathetic host, or a host toward an uncomfortable guest. I could not have told which. I hurried on through several more rooms. There was always another one, in all of which people were staying. There were expensive clothes lying about. I was afraid someone would come in and see me. I heard voices outside one door. I had no right in the rooms of my guests, and they would know I was running away. In the last room there was a lady at a dressing table. She had her back to me, and did not turn as I was hurrying through the room. I did not let my eyes rest on the mirror. I dreaded what I knew I should see. But I kept my glance fixed on the back of her head, with its fine and sheeny coiffure, and I saw it move as if she had heard me just as I got out of the door. I sped through the hallway. There was a little servant's staircase, and I skimmed down it, just grazing the steps and steadying myself on the railing by touching it with the tips of my fingers. It kept on turning, and I could not see behind to know whether I were being followed. Below, in a little side hall, I was close to the party again. I could hear their loud guffawing and gabbling. But there was a door there that led out of the house. I opened it very softly and adroitly, slipped out and closed it quickly behind me, and now found myself at last, with what freedom and relief, in darkness and solitude again. Part 3. I got hurriedly into a car that looked like mine, but I didn't feel safe till the key had worked. As I pulled out, I was further reassured by recognizing the Blackburn's drive, down the steep curves of which I was coasting. Yet once out on the main road, I had tremors of doubt, not always sure that I knew where the cross streets were, or which turning I ought to take. I must be awfully drunk, I thought. I should have to watch myself to get home. That enchanted country of drink that was the world one had been young in the 20s. One drank to go back there, where one's friends were, where life was irresponsible and daring, where it was passionate, amusing, and frank. One got homesick under the grind of the depression, and one could not help slipping away. But then one did not find what one had come for. One's friends were no more their old selves than one was one's old self. One could pick up one's cues for the old clever play, but a moment of alcoholic revelation would show up its essential banality, its superficiality, its falsity, and one would walk out with indignation and rudeness. So this evening, I now concluded, I must first, over my highballs, have been carried away by some fantasy of a future with Joe, which had quite made me forget the actual company, some bright vision of rejoining the 20s in Joe's little house on the coast, and then, of course, I had suffered a revulsion. Had I failed to say good-night to the Blackburns? Had I done something more or less awful in that room where the ladies left their wraps? What had I been doing there? The whole thing was rather dim in my mind, and my conviction of triumph at escaping prevailed over misgivings of guilt. A drink, when I got home, would sustain me. I should glory in having fled. I could rejoin there my old solitary self, the self for which I really lived and which kept up its austere virtue, the self which had survived through these trashy years, and here was my drive through the woods. I turned in, past the letterbox on its post, not even looking to make sure of my name there. And there was my light through the trees. How stabilizing to drive up beside my buried stone house, a lodge that was almost a castle, and put my car in my own garage, to open my own front door, to find everything just as I had left it. The single lamp in the living room was on, my book lay face down on the couch. I could not really be terribly tight, and I positively could not be dreaming, for in dreams things were always different, and here things were all just the same. I picked the book up and looked at the pages. It was the big one-volume edition of Spangler. I checked also on the Matisse drawing, which I had bought with half the advance for my book, and of which I knew every line. I examined the telephone table where the colored girl had scrawled a message to call a Mr. Somebody or other. I could not make out the name and could not recognize the number, and had a moment's disgust at the thought that this unknown person might call again. But the room was all right, reassuring. Here was my place in the woods, small but sound, where I had made myself independent and built my own kingdom of thought. I stood in the middle of the room and looked proudly at the big stone fireplace, the door onto the flagged back porch that looked down onto the little river, the high ceiling that went up to a peak. And there was the door that led into my study, and the door that led into the hallway, and into those bedrooms that were almost monastic. It had the dignity, that rude yet snug little house, of everything in my life that was good. I had just put a mark in the Spangler and was about to turn off the light, when the silence of that room, which seemed almost my mind, was broken by a sharp clack, clack, clack. I tried to insist for a second that it was only a noise of the night, the floor cracking or a branch rattling, but it did have the purposive accent of somebody at the little iron knocker, and after a pause it clack, clack, clacked again. I wondered a moment whether I could not ignore it and let the visitor go away, but I was standing in plain view of the front windows, and it would be too embarrassing, I felt, to have someone look in and see me. Yet I waited a little time still, immobilized, with the book in my hand. The next knock was a pounding that jolted me. The visitor had abandoned the knocker and was using his fist on the door. I strode over and yanked it open. There, pale, with tie askew and suit unpressed, evidently well soaked in drink, leered out from under an old soft hat, Cy Banks. "Just thought I'd drop in," he said. "I saw that you fled the party, and it inspired me with the same idea." There was nothing to do but to have him in. His drunkenness and rascality bore down on me like a messy but not unwelcome doom. In rejecting the big house, after all, I had let myself in for this, and it was good to have a companion in protest. I got out the tray with the whiskey and ice and put it down, where it was pleasantly convenient, on the little low table by the couch, and now I found that I rather looked forward to talking things over with Cy. "Well, what did you get out of it tonight?" I asked. "Why, I absolutely got the conviction that Kate Blackburn would be our next president." "She is getting along pretty fast. The whole thing affected me very unpleasantly." "You know, she's practically bankrupted poor Ed, financing her campaign for the Senate. And she won't let him invite his friends anymore if they're on the wrong side politically. Bert Mangiari, the local boss, used to be a great pal of Ed's, you know. She only invites people that can do her some good." I saw that Cy was going to be at his best, extravagant but essentially serious. "What were we doing there then?" I asked. I was holding on my open hand a little puppet from a child's Punch and Judy show, a toy devil with a black face, a red coat, and black, spindling wooden legs that dangled. "She thinks we're pinks who will influence the liberals, but I'm against government by women more than anything else in the world. I'd vote against the best bill ever drafted if Kate Blackburn were the person who was sponsoring it. That's one reason I don't like the New Deal. Too many women in power. I tell you, the real lineup today is not between the classes anymore, and it's not between the democratic and the totalitarian states. It's the war between men and women. Thurber's the great prophet of the time. We guys have got to stick together if we want to keep it a man's world. The magazines are all written for women, the columnists are getting to be women, and if you turn on the radio, you hear some goddamn woman squawking about foreign affairs. If we don't stick together now, they'll get us." I had put my hand inside the puppet and made it stand up and wave its arms. Cy giggled. "The horns hurt a little," he said. Where had the little black devil come from? A suspicion disturbed my mind that Cy might be an agent of the Blackburns, sent to tempt me again even here. But he was right after all, I reflected. I was glad that I had let Jo go. It would be better to risk losing her entirely than to run the chance of living her life. Cy Banks, in bad shape though he was, had at least escaped from that sort of fate. He had deserted the strong-minded girl whom he had married in his early 20s and who had objected to his friends in the village, and now he had to give up part of his salary for the support of her and her child. But he did have his uninhibited freedom, and I thought he would write something someday. Here he had staggered in tonight like the jackdaw of Reims, cursed by bell and book, his hair sticking up behind and the two bottom buttons off his vest, but not merely appealing to compassion, inspiring also a certain respect by the purity of his love of letters and his stubborn insistence on his right to judge the actions and values of the world. Had I not much more in common with Cy than with any of those false, solid people, than with that stupid old school friend, for example, with whom I had been wasting my time? The only things that were supremely worth doing had to be put through outside all that. The way Cy and I chose to live, in Greenwich Village or in the forest. I told him, and as I did so was conscious of my superior and mocking tone, that he reminded me of the jackdaw of Reims. "I haven't stolen anything," he said. "Yes, you have. Wherever you are, they feel that somebody is laughing at them, and that steals some of their self-respect. I almost got stultified at the Blackburns tonight, but somewhere there was a leak and a draft, and it must have been caused by your presence." I was warming, feeling more and more cordial. Why shouldn't I talk freely with him? I was thoroughly glad he had come. "The Inglesby legends are marvelous, aren't they?" he began, with that fine light in his eye that always woke me to a responsive enthusiasm. "Nobody seems to know them anymore. I discovered them one summer on the Cape when I'd gone up there to visit my aunt. I used to read them all afternoon in a hot bedroom up under the eaves, and I'd hear the one train a day from Boston whistling at 3 o'clock. Boston seemed a long way off, and there was nothing beyond but Boston. All the rest of the world, such as New York, was a great deal more unreal to me then than the world of the Inglesby legends." "I read them at my aunt's, too, curiously enough," I answered with a thrill of remembrance, "right here in Hecate County. The Cruikshank illustrations I really liked better than the poems, though, and I went through the albums of Hogarth and some big volumes they had of the antiquities of Rome. I used to hear the whir of the lawn-mower and the crack of people hitting croquet balls." "Everything was so quiet and dependable," he said. "There was plenty of time to look at pictures and read long poems in big armchairs, but we can never get back to that now." I was moved, I found, almost to tears by the thought of the beauty and pathos of those days when one had read through the afternoons. It was as if my own youth sat beside me. He was several years younger than I, had been a freshman when I was a senior, and with his smooth brow, his twinkling eye, and his black Charlie Chaplin mustache, which I imagined he had originally intended to have a gay cavalier look, and which did preserve a touch of the dashing, he had always remained boyish. I had been just such a solitary child, silently in love with excellence and unable ever to take quite seriously the respectable pursuits of my elders. And now that childhood was still with me there. It had come to me in dear little Cy, to reassure me, entertain me, renew me. The character in the Inglesby legends that I've really felt most like tonight, he was picked up by some stimulating and droll idea, is the man with the severed head. Do you remember that? Hamilton Tighe? And he cries, "Take away that lubberly chap that sits there and grins with his head in his lap." I could see the grisly picture with the bristling hair, the bared teeth, and the glaring eyes. That's really the way I've been all evening. I was thinking tonight at the party that I was like Bertram del Borneo in Dante, you know? He holds his head like a lantern. I was going to do a poem about it. But the grinning old fool is much better. It's curious how frightening that idea is. I suppose it's the split personality. That's just the way I was sitting, that picture, holding my head in my lap like a hat, while it went on laughing at everything insanely. And in the meantime, the rest of the body is quivering and shaking all over. This vision did scare me a moment. I wondered again whether they could have sent him. "It's still detachable, I think," he said, grinning. "Would you like to have me put it in your lap?" He was raising his arms to his head as if he were going to lift it off, but I stopped him. I could not stand this. I pulled his hands down and held them. I noticed how fine they were, sensitive, nervous, and slim, not practical and knuckled like Joe's. "Don't worry about yourself," I said. "You better have another drink. Why don't you stay here tonight? It's too far to go back to the Point." I was still holding down his hands, and my tenderness seemed overflowing in an emotion uncontrollable, demoralizing, yet too quickly becoming welcome. I looked up at him, and he met my glance with a self-conscious, half-feminine smile. He was giggling in a way that I did not like. It made a grating, disagreeable sound. "That's the oven birds," I said. "Don't worry. It's all done by a little brown bird that builds a nest in the underbrush." And I fixed my attention on the bird where it perched on a branch just above us, its tiny body so tense and vibrant as it pumped out its raucous notes. I concentrated on driving it away, and I yelled at it again and again, but I couldn't make it stir from the branch. It kept up its harsh, reiterated rasping. "What's the matter?" said Jo. I had waked her up, and she looked at me over her shoulder. I saw that her eyes were puffy. "It's those goddamn oven birds," I cried with menacing indignation. "They make that damn racket every morning." I lay there a few minutes listening, then leapt up and rather gropingly but determinedly got my feet into my slippers at the bedside and propelled myself out of the house, picking up on my way through the living room a burst tennis racket and some old magazines. and standing in the damp June morning with the grass about my half-bare feet, I hurled these up at the high tops of the locusts in which exasperating New Year's Eve rattles seemed hideously to be scratching the dawn. I saw the little birds fly quickly away, and I returned to the house relieved. I started to climb into bed with the bottoms of my pajama pants wet, but I realized that that wouldn't do, and went to the bathroom and dried my ankles, and took off the pajama bottom and got back into bed without it. The birds had by this time begun again, having merely withdrawn a short distance. I cursed them more bitterly. "God damn them," I said. "They oughtn't to have birds like that in summer." "Don't be so frantic," said Jo. There she lay beside me, solid and warm and always so fundamentally good-natured. We had not made love the night before, as we usually did when she came out to see me. I had worked up a hypocritical quarrel with her about her going away to the coast. "I'm sorry I was nasty last night," I said. I was glad to see her teeth were all right, and that her lips were clean and straight. In those days, what with reverie and alcohol and art, I carried so much of dreaming into real life and so much of my real life into dreams, as I have sometimes done in telling these stories, that I was not always quite sure which was which. We repaired our omission of the evening before, and it was as if I had been purified and freed from that nightmare that had still hung in my mind like the headache of an asphyxiation. "You've never been in the Southwest, have you?" she asked as I lay with my arm around her. "You like living in the woods so much you ought to be crazy about those great big forests that they have in the Jemez Mountains. I've promised to take Billy out there for a month or so sometime this summer. Why don't you come out and join us?" And suddenly, for the first time in my life, it dramatically flashed upon me that I, too, could climb the mountain trails and ride among the western cattle and hear the cougar cry. A few weeks on a ranch in New Mexico, not a dude ranch at all, she assured me, would rescue me from Hecate County and put me in touch with that heroic America, the America I had sniffed from our inlets and brushed through in the tangled grove, and it would carry along my relations with Jo. There would be no time for anyone else to make an impression on her. So still we turned west, as our fathers had done, for the new life we could still hope to find. So we sought to regain that new world which seemed still to be just at hand, with its wild forest trails and fresh waters, but from which we now found ourselves divided by a pane of invisible glass. It was not really the new country anymore, it was the old country. We had passed it in history, and the loves and achievements of our youth had all taken place somewhere else. When Jo and I later that summer came to visit the corn dance at Cositi, the cave-dwellers' canyon of Frijoles, the old mining towns with their overgrown diggings, all those primitive and romantic things, we were to find that the hangover by the cold mountain stream made it hard for us to see the bright morning, that the space of the gigantic pastures turned to boredom before we had crossed them, that the tall, intimidating presence of the forests of aspen and pine, with their alien life that excluded ours, only left us the more alone with the strain of our wrong relation. We were to find the fears and suffocations, the drugged energies of Hecate County. I had packed my bad nights with my baggage, and I was later to look back with more pleasure on the excitement I had felt that morning when I had first had the vision of Jo as an exhilarating Western girl, laughing her open-air laugh in my tight little comfortable house, and hungrily devouring my breakfast as we had planned the exploits before us. The stars move still, time runs, the clock will strike. This concludes the reading of Memoirs of Hecate County by Edmund Wilson. Your reader has been Wolfram Kandinsky.